Okay, so good morning everyone. My name is Line Lauritsen from Aarhus University, and I'd like to start off by thanking the organizers of this conference and the session organizers in particular, focusing on archaeological representations and visualization. What I would like to do in the next 15 minutes is to discuss how we as archaeologists create and disseminate knowledge through graphical representations of data. And through a case study, I will highlight how we can begin to consider the epistemic significance of graphs in archaeology. I'd like to stress that this is an initial analysis of visual media and would warmly welcome feedback of any of the elements contained within. So, the field of archaeological representations has really grown into its own over the last decade, following a paradigm shift, acknowledging that the narratives we produce are products of socially embedded activity, as the very people who construct these narratives cannot be viewed as pure and unsullied pieces of information. So, So archaeologists over the last decade have stressed the role of scientific illustrations and this sullied information in the creation of this expert knowledge. See, for instance, some of these very influential titles up here. While so graphical summaries of data have not been subject to such scrutiny, given that they are often perceived as objective. But are the graphs we present as archaeologists or produce faithful representations of the data we use? And do we communicate the true relationship between groups of independent variables and dependent variables? And how do stylistic elements, for example, influence the take-home message, and what biases may be unintentionally present? The archaeological graphic designer has a number of responsibilities when producing graphical summaries of data. From the very first graphs made by William Playfair in the late 1700s until today, these have had a specific intention. And according to Edward Tufte, the graph must be instruments to help people reason about quantitative information and, above all, show the data. So the graphical designer also needs to make ever-increasing larger data sets coherent and scale down a corpus of information into a number of pixels. And above all, they need to induce the viewer to think about its substance rather than about the methodology. Other responsibilities include the appropriateness of colors and patterns, such as this chart junk displayed up here, within the visual representation of data. However, there are a number of problems in producing an objective graph. We as humans are visual beings, and the visual media appeals to us. However, we as archaeologists are rarely trained in the power of graphical representation and how to communicate data effectively. We rarely employ manuals of graphical standards, such as that of Edward Tufte, for instance. And with the multitude of different software available, every aspect of a graph is changeable, and thus the epistemic value of a graph may differ given who's producing it. And when highlighting elements of a graph through text, we triangulate the reader to a certain graphical element to persuade and reinforce a narrative or argument. So, looking at the graphs out there, for instance, an Excel graph, Excel-generated graph. The used software might influence how we perceive the graph in question, a form of perception bias, if you wish. That's not to say that Excel graphs should be considered inferior or even superior, but rather that the time and effort placed into how data is communicated may be questioned if software defaults are observed. So through these considerations, there's then a clear need to self-reflect and to consider how we communicate within these black box methods, in our own subdiscipline and more generally. And over the last 25 years, archaeologists working with the analysis of artifact shape have shifted from traditional lineal methods of measurement to a more global perception of artifact shape, where they analyze points of correspondence, surface, and outlines now commonly known as geometric morphometrics. In this, mean shapes can be constructed, and the main theoretical sources of shape variance can be documented through various ordination-based methods. These more powerful methods, utilizing a greater amount of information, are able to investigate changes in artifact shape on varying levels of scale. Representation and the use of illustration is therefore essential in communicating these changes in shape, and a specific suite of visual aids have been constructed to communicate this analytical output. These include aspects of transformation through a number of visual methodologies, for instance, thin plate splines, contours, heat maps, etc. And the representation of all shapes or specimen present through stacking and listing, each with their own illustrative customization. But these representations have not undergone scrutiny in terms of their production and how effective these transformations communicate the change. Which of these images, for example, best communicate the shape change from A to B? How successful is this contour map, this one here, in displaying shape change? And how about if we're considering the totality of evidence available and the associated shape change? Does a stack, that one over there, better demonstrate the variability of artifacts portray, or does a catalog of images provide a better heuristic? Fundamentally, these models are abstract representations of artifacts. They are the reduction of material culture into nodes and points. And to paraphrase Latour, it is these abstract elements, the figures produced and the graphs we make, which count, not the actual artifact. However, while we can discuss the fundamental properties in the normative practice of producing shape-based graphical summaries, so far these are generalizations built on subjective evidence, and there is a necessity to understand and define the actual normative practice. And throughout the 25 years of geometric morphometrics being employed within archaeology, what visual trends do we see? Are these linked to specific phenomena, such as the increasing variety of data software? Have standards been noted and conventions created? And how does the increasing competence of archaeological data analysts factor into this? And ultimately, how normal is the normative practice? To examine these relationships, we used Elsevier's Scopus database of all peer-reviewed scientific literature. We extracted all 44 archaeological articles utilizing geometric morphometrics, and using this, we then collated all images and figures, in total 379, which explicitly referred to archaeological shape analysis, before constructing a breakdown of the figures created and the articles examined. These include the representation of landmarks, the specific ordination and discrimination techniques used, the shape changes present and their associated warp type, the representation of mean shapes, and other aspects previously noted, including annotation. Other elements, including summary statistic tables, were noted. However, given differences in publishing standards and particularly cost associated with the use of color and the number of figures, these two latter elements are here not examined. With these categories and the absence of stylistic features and statistics, we here provide an initial analysis into trends documented over the last quarter of the century. One of the typical initial figures illustrate that the beginning of a text is one where the landmark positions are noted. Are visually noted. In doing this, the reader is able to engage what aspect of the artifact shape are chosen and consider the chosen points of correspondence against other elements of the shape. It also adds clarity to what could have been a dense chunk of text in a method section. And using Excel, we see when reviewing the data that it is evident that this has become more commonplace over the last half a decade. Only one example noted from 2015 onwards does not feature such a model diagram as this one over here. In analyzing the transformation of shape, the displaying of principal component analysis has become more commonplace over the years, particularly in contrast to before 2010, when they were not the norm. With regards to discrimination-based methods, a change is slowly occurring with its increased adoption. This is important not so much in a visualization sense, but in a statistical and methodological sense, in that archaeologists are taking into consideration the teasing apart of groups by shape, which is a theme commonly critiqued by morphometricians outside of archaeology. However, while this is strongly suggestive of increasing competency within the discipline, there is perhaps a danger in its use, reflecting a leftover of old archaeological traditions of wanting to emphasize typologies with the placing of artifacts into shape boxes. However, this is probably not a trend that should be wished for, as geometric morphometrics might be abused as the search for these typologies. Another trend appears to be the use of displaying mean shapes that do not exist in the archaeological record, but rather serve as a representation of common practice in artifact form. As the figure demonstrates, while mean shapes are not extensively used prior to 2010, almost half of all archaeologists after appear to be adopting these visualization conventions. In representing the change from one shape to another, through the study of archaeological morphometrics, increasing variability is noted. Prior to 2010, TPS grids are commonly used, with mean shapes also utilized, and following this, a variety of different techniques, including arrows and heat maps, are evident. This pattern also continues into the last few years. As you can see on the slide, these can be of varying complexity, despite the two figures being relatively simple in their shape. But can the figure on the left better display the change from one shape to another, given the high data ink ratio and noise? Could a form like the figure on the right suffice, or better communicate this change? The increasing variability exemplified perhaps represents, similar to the previous slide, both the increased variety of techniques available in recording shape change and increasing technological competency. Finally, can the complete absence of contour-based changes changes also be the result of archaeologists acknowledging its possible redundancy as a mechanism for visual shape change? Finally, few in the data set adopt annotation-based features, perhaps to rather explain these figures in detail throughout the text or to reduce noise on a graph, unlike the case on the right. And hopefully, throughout this PowerPoint, we've demonstrated how graphical representations of data should be examined in a way similar to that of archaeological reconstructions and illustrations, methods cementing the very discipline of archaeological representations. And with a multitude of ways that graphs can be made and the abundance of different stylistic features available for individual graphs, the archaeologist needs to reflect on the choices made throughout this knowledge-creating process. As a case study of a normative practice has highlighted, increasing analytical competence and software allows a diverse array of images to be produced even within such a small sub-discipline. And perhaps rather than just using visual techniques because they may be new or fancy looking, they may not always communicate a message effectively. The archaeologist always needs to reflect on the reason we produce graphs, and rather than dictating whether conventions should be employed, such as tout, a level of sensitivity is perhaps needed. Perhaps we may need to be more explicit in our methodologies why we produce graphs the way they are. A picture is worth 1,000 words after all. Thank you.